Good morning. I just spent the last hour talking to a kid about losing your salvation. So my brain's been spinning already for a while. So let's pray, welcome, and let's do this. Lord, thanks for time together. Thank you that you do love us. We can't lose our salvation because it wasn't our call. You moved in our hearts, and you graciously, as we worked through grace last time, introduced us to Jesus. So thank you that everyone's here. We're here together to worship you, to be thankful for what you've done for us in Jesus. We think already of Kent as he's sitting in his office, kind of finalizing his sermon. Be with him, those who sing. Cool that Bruce could be here, even though he sings. And be honored in all that we do. You know our stories and what we've been through. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Are you not playing piano today?
No, they have another piano player.
Is that good or bad?
I think it's good for now.
Okay. They wanted me to play, and I told them I couldn't.
For the next 16 weeks.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, he came in as I came in.
Yeah, pretty much.
Tall dude. I mean, no, he walked in as I walked in. That's what I meant. Yeah. Yeah, I said hello to him. I didn't want to because, I am a Christian, but I figured at least I could do. All right, so we got some new guys. You guys can introduce yourselves. Well, let's roll here because whoever wrote these notes wrote a bunch, so let's move. We're doing the book of Ruth, and it's really going to be cool. Often what you see, I was talking to my son last night just about the book of Ruth, and often what it's presented as is simply a book on female qualities to be like Christ or something, which at some levels really, I guess, okay. Ruth's got some cool stuff about her, but it's so much bigger than that. If you look at my little introduction, it functions as a transitional story between the judges and the kings. You know the judges, right? Samuel's the last of the judges. Othniel, I have them listed here, and we'll go through them. And it provides a solution to the national crisis at the end of Judges. The national crisis is going to be the world's a mess. Israel has become both polytheistic and sexually deviant. Two characteristics, and we're going to see that the refrain is there was no king. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. So we're going to see that the book of Ruth is really an introduction to David. The solution to the judges is a king. And we'll get to that. And it develops the idea of kinsman redeemer, which we'll also look at. So it's pretty cool. There's so many themes. And so what we're going to do is our first 3 weeks, I apologize already, we're not even going to get to Ruth until the fourth week. So, hey, no mocking. No mocking from the European contingent, please. So some goals of this class. Today we're going to learn some about biblical, our Hebrew narrative. Everything you wanted to know about Hebrew narrative, but we're afraid to ask. Some historical theological background for the placement of Ruth. Like in the Hebrew text, Ruth is in the wisdom books. In the English text, Ruth is right after Judges. And so why? Why placed in different places? Then we're going to work through the text of Ruth, and then how it provides this answer with David. And then the book of Ruth is actually the story of Jesus. I have a friend I worked with. He was the head of the Old Testament department at Knox Seminary. And he's been doing a study using Luke 24. We'll spend a day looking at Luke 24, where Jesus is on the road to Emmaus. And he talks to these two guys and says, he refers to the three different parts, really two parts, but there's a third part that he references later to the Old Testament Hebrew text. And he says, they're all about me. And so what Warren Gage has done is he's gone over about 100 stories. And his premise, based on Luke 24, is that every story is really about the death and resurrection of Jesus. And that the trajectory of the entire, not that you find Jesus in the Old Testament, but that he is the subject matter. And so we will spend a couple weeks playing with that idea. It's actually, and so that revolutionizes even how you understand Ruth. There's going to be a scene, and we'll look at it today in Ruth. The pivotal scene in Ruth is the threshing floor, if you know the story. And we're going to see how that is really a retelling of an earlier story that we'll look at today. But it's a redeeming of that, and I'll introduce all that. And so, goals. Today you've got the goals. We want to look at the birth of Moab and the curse of the Moabites, and then Israel, the new. So this is sort of. The top of page 2 is your outline. And so here's our introduction stuff. What we're doing today. The birth of Moab and the curse of the Moabites. That's fascinating. And then the new Sodom. That's fascinating. It's this story of, it's a wonderful biblical story that you use for your first graders on the rape of a concubine. One, that a judge, a religious leader, has basically a kept woman. And secondly, he allows her to be raped all night in the name of Jesus. I mean, it's a horrible story. And then we'll move to Ruth, and then we'll do the gospel in the book of Ruth. Got it? So here we go. We're going to start with Hebrew narrative. Any questions already? Why? Can I leave? Do I get my money back? I already told Ann she gets her money back if after today she doesn't come back. Do you know these guys all paid $10 to be here? Really? Yeah. You got free. You get first week free. Next week if you stay. Yeah. Well, for new people, they're sort of grandfathered or grandmothered in. So yours might be double digits, depending on how much trouble you cause. Your glasses are a little bright, too. I'm not sure that's acceptable. Oh, that's just what I need.
Thank you. That's good.
What?
You're already teasing her.
Yeah, I'm teasing her. Well, Joanne told me nobody likes her, so. I'm kidding. She didn't say that. All right, here we go. Yeah, I know. You can tell I haven't been here for a while. It's time to.
We're hard-headed Dutch ladies.
I see, if you're Dutch, you can handle anything. I got it. I know the stories. All right, so we're going to look at Hebrew narrative, page 3. So the Hebrew text is broken into two sort of main types of writing, genre, I guess you could say, narrative and poetry. Poetry, Psalms, Proverbs, even Ecclesiastes, it's got some narrative in it. And then it's got these large areas of narrative. I would even say Genesis 1 is actually poetry, not narrative. But narrative is storytelling. And so you've got the story that begins in Genesis and goes to the end of Kings, where they're returned from the exile, where they go into the exile. And then you've got the ones after the poetry section, where you've got Ezra, Nehemiah, and you've got more narrative. I'll try to work through this. Some scholars used to claim that the biblical writers were primitive, because what you're going to find is it's a very specific way of writing. We wouldn't write that way. We would write differently, and they write in a way, and we're going to see that they leave out a lot of details. And so scholars said, well, these guys aren't very good. What we don't have with our Hebrew text is we don't have rules on how we're supposed to read it. We just have the text. And so anything people come up with is always based on reading the text, and then here are their conclusions, rather than here's a grammar book to explain it for you. So you read the text, and they say, well, this is pretty primitive. It doesn't tell me everything I would like to know. But now they're finding that these guys really are master storytellers. And it's in the story that you get a lot of the theology. So you'll see, it used to be then they'd look at these sources, and it's pretty much dead now, but they'd break the first 5 books in the Old Testament into 4 different sources, and written by different people, and they sort of mixed and matched, and it didn't do a great job. But now they're finding that these stories, because stories were repeated. Remember, Abraham pretends that Sarah's his sister, and then Isaac pretends that Rebekah's his sister. How is it possible that 2 guys do the exact same thing at the same place? Must be a mythical story or something back there, and they both copied it. They're not historical. So the seams between what they consider to be different sources. So in between is material that feels a little different than what you're reading already, and they didn't like that. And then the simple and streamlined style. But it's through these stories that we become part of the larger story, the meta-narrative of God's involvement with humanity. You know meta-narrative. Meta-narrative is a term that says it's a story that explains all of reality from beginning to end. Everybody's got some sort of meta-narrative. Except in our culture, we've rejected meta-narratives, especially sort of the white man's meta-narrative. And instead, what you get are stories coming out. It really started, I think, with the movie Dances with Wolves, where all of a sudden the white dudes were the bad guys and the Indians were the good guys. And John Wayne had made it a good Indian is the one that you scalp. And now all of a sudden Dances with Wolves, you get to know them. And so now you have all these little stories under the radar, even Flags of Our Fathers by Clint Eastwood. And then the other one, Letters of Iwo Jima, where he does the other side of the story, where the letters written by the Japanese stories back to their mom. That wouldn't have happened a generation ago. And you're finding these smaller stories, but even there, they're finding that we're created in such a way that you need an overarching story. Where did we come from? Where are we going? What happens when we die? And so the Bible gives you this meta-narrative. But these scholars used to look behind the text. So we'd read a text. They didn't care about the story in the text. They wanted to find out the history of Israel either behind the text or the religious practices behind the text. So they would read the story, jettison the story, and say, here's what's going on behind the text. It's fascinating, but it turns out really not to work. The second one is we tend to look, this is two, I'm skipping some here so we can keep going here. Conservatives tend to look under the text. That is, we will read the text, and instead of enjoying the text, we will get the timeless truth behind the text. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. And so rather than playing with the picture of Psalm 23, we'll come up with a statement that says, God will always provide everything you need. Now that's true, but what you've just done is you've ignored the poetry of the text. And so we as conservatives have tended to do that. The text itself becomes a gateway to principles for life. 10 steps to a happy life. And I can get them from all over the Bible. The method often leads to ignoring of the story as story. It's the very way a story is told in the Bible that tells you what's going on. In fact, the theme that you're going to see in Judges, as we look at that, preparing for Ruth, is that what I said to you, there was no king. Judges is going to run with an opening statement about sort of the decrepitness of Israel. Then it's going to give you all the judges, and then two final stories. And these two final stories begin and end, and in the middle, it has the statement about there is no king. And if you miss that, you miss the story. So it's best to top of three. So it's best to stick with the story as story. Both what is said and how it is said, founded on the idea that the events really occurred. That's huge. Those who go behind the text, the earlier liberals, I guess you would say, they don't care if it really happened. In fact, they don't think it really happened. When I was at Princeton, the earliest that they thought something could be actual was with David. So Moses didn't exist. Samuel maybe didn't exist. Abraham didn't exist. Clearly, God didn't create the world. So all of that get rejected, and the only reason they accepted David maybe is because there was an outside, like a big stone, a stela that had his name. It looked like it said House of Dowd, which are the Hebrew letters for David. And they said, so maybe David really existed. Just this week, in a parking lot in Tel Aviv, I think, it had to be Tel Aviv. It doesn't make sense, but I think that's where it was. They found little ivory pieces, 1,500 pieces. And it's the first time they found ivory. Well, if you read Solomon's account of the temple, there are all these ivory pieces. And they found that they're a lot like the Assyrian ivory pieces they found. And so what they're finding is sort of corroboration of the biblical story, but people don't like that it could be historical. With conservatives, we really don't care if the story happened. Now, we say we do. We do say it matters. But by ignoring the story, we ignore the events. Like there was a real woman named Ruth. Now, whether that was her name or not, because we'll see the names actually have meaning. But there was this real woman who left Bethlehem. She went to another country, her homeland actually. She was there. Her husband dies. She goes back to Israel. There's a guy named Boaz, and he has a son who has a son who has a son. His name is David. And so even if it's a story, it's not fiction. There's a guy, Robert Alter, who says he uses both terms. It's either historized fiction, that is, it's fiction made to look like history, George Washington chopping down the cherry tree, or it's fictionalized history. There's a kernel of truth, but they fill in all the gaps because we don't know anything that happened. So the stories then, D, are the means by which we learn theology. God did not give us a systematic theology. There's this big debate on how, systematic theology, right? You've got your big book, and if you have a subject, you look it up, and it says every verse on this particular topic. And we like those, except if you haven't done the story, a biblical theology doesn't care about where it came from, doesn't care about where it is in redemptive history. It just is. And you've got to read the stories before you can do this sort of theology. As Richard Pratt says, our boy Richard, who is here, he gave us stories. So the goal is to become close readers of the text. They're funny stories. One of the 8th grade teachers, Mr. Manugian, is the principal of the middle school. Joel Schaefer loves the story about Ehud. You know that story? And it's a story about this fat guy. He's one of the judges. And we won't look at it, but it's all about him stabbing a king who is so big that he stabs him with an 18-inch sword and it goes into his stomach and it disappears. And he's sitting on his throne, his actual throne, but his throne is also his toilet. It does double duty. So he's sitting on his throne. And he starts to smell because he's dead and all the odors are coming out. And so he's in his little room and the doors are closed and his assistants won't go in because they smell it. And they're afraid he's on the throne. And they don't want to walk in while he's going to the bathroom, but he's really dead. And the dude gets to escape. The judge, Ehud, gets to escape because underneath the toilet, it goes down into a hole and you can climb out and out. And he only gets to escape because he's left-handed. Because everyone's right-handed, because this is your dirty hand. You'd never have a sword in your left hand because this is the hand you wipe with. But he was a left-handed Benjaminite, and so they're sneaky. And his sword was on the other leg, so when they checked him, they checked the leg that the sword should be on, and it wasn't there. Clearly has no sword. It was on the other leg. And it's all this satire, but you get it in the story. And if you miss the story, you miss sort of the humor. If there's a bad guy, he's worth making fun about. And that's what they do an awful lot. So here we go, some characteristics. I said you can do other characteristics, but here's some of the characteristics you see in Ruth. First, we start with the narrator. The narrator is not the author of the text. So when you read, and we're going to have a narrator, in those days there was a famine in the land of Israel, and so they go to Moab. You've got someone giving you the story. That's not the author. That's the narrator. Narrators tell you the story, and they are characters as much as anybody else is a character. So there is, depending on who you ask, there is an author, but there's an implied author. So there's an author, but there's the way the author presents himself to the readers. So, and then he has a narrator. So you've got it's sort of a bigger field than we often recognize. There's an audience. So this was written to a particular audience, but it was not written to a real audience. It was written to an audience of the writer's thinking. This is to whom it's written. And then there's us. We're an audience, but we're not the audience that they wrote it to. But we're reading it. And so since God is the author, we really are the audience, but not in the way that the writer would have understood. Does that make sense? I think it's fascinating because it makes your brain spin. And there's a lot more going on. So there's a narrator, and he's a character. He's not the author. He's a character. He's the mouthpiece of the author. And so what's cool is the writer can say anything he wants through the narrator. And then if you call him on it, he can say, well, that's the narrator's fault, not mine. So an author can actually present things that he or she disagrees with because the narrator is presenting them. That makes sense? So you read a Clancy novel. I was just watching Hunt for Red October. You go back and read the old Hunt for Red October. Clancy's narrator can have a different view on Russia than he does, and it's okay. Secondly, this narrator is omniscient. He knows everything. He knows, he has a godlike view of the world, and this is going to be fascinating. He knows what everyone does. So when the story is written, it's written in, Hebrew doesn't have tenses, it has aspects. So it's written in completed action. So if you read Ruth, everything is, Ruth went. Everything has already happened, however many thousands of years ago. So from us, it'd be 3,000 years ago. But once you enter the story, even though the grammar itself is completed action, once you enter in, it's as if the story itself is still unfolding. That makes sense? So we don't know how the story ends. So we read the story as if we don't know, or we read the story and we don't know, even though it's already been completed. And the one who knows everything about everybody is the narrator. He knows where everybody is, so he'll take us from Bethlehem to Moab. And the people in Bethlehem don't know about Moab, and the people in Moab don't know about Bethlehem, but the writer does. And then he chooses to let us know what's going on. And in fact, when they go to Bethlehem, he begins with Bethlehem and ends with Bethlehem. And he tells us stuff that even the characters don't know. So we as readers get more information than the characters because the narrator is the one who knows everything. Does that make sense? So he's the one, or she, you could say she, but in that world it'd probably be a he, knows everything. He's the one who has the chess pieces and moves them around. He knows what everyone does, no matter where they are, what everyone says, and he knows what everybody thinks. So you'll hear sometimes, so-and-so said in his heart. Well, who knows what someone says in their heart? Except the narrator. He even, and this is the amazing part, top of page 5, he even knows what God thinks. Who knows what God thinks? Nobody. God said in his heart. So Genesis 6, remember, God relented. God grieved that he had made humans. Well, God doesn't have a mouth. He doesn't speak. And if he does, did he come to the narrator and say, let me tell you what I'm thinking? But instead, as the writer of the story, the narrator is somehow given privilege into the very thinking of God. So we're going to see even that in this story. He controls the story. So the story, we would say, actually happened, but he tells it as a story. He's in charge of how the story is told, what to tell, how to tell it, so that it is a selective story. Like I tell Kent, anytime he tells a story, he always alters things to fit. He doesn't make it a lie, but every story either includes or doesn't include things. So I can tell you a story about my driving yesterday that makes it look like every driver in Miami is a moron. And it would be true. I could tell you about a story being driving yesterday, and everything I would tell you would make me look like a total idiot. And it would be true. And which is it? It just depends on how you tell it. So my kids used to tell me stories, and I'd say, and there'd be different stories on the same event. And then I'd say, my son Schaefer, he was my truth teller. Schaefer, what really happened? And then I'd get the facts, nothing but the facts. The Bible then doesn't give you the facts. It's based on facts, but it gives you a story, which is much more compelling. We love stories. We like movies. We like books. And so we live in stories. He picks the main events and then all the particulars of those events. He controls what the reader knows and when that information is revealed. He's much more concerned to teach theology than to report an event. So every story we get is a theological history. Ruth is going to be a theological history. The issue is not this woman lived in Moab and she came to Bethlehem. Thank God she got food. It's going to be so much deeper than that. But in order to get there, you kind of have to play by his rules. And he tells any story in order to further that goal. I have a friend who's an Egyptian. This is, imagine if the Egyptians had the Passover narrative. You know the Passover narrative, right? You read the Exodus story. The bad guys are always the Egyptians. They get their stuff plundered, their firstborn die, and they drown in the Red Sea. I was in Egypt, and I was hanging with a guy. And he said, you know, every time I read the Bible, I always lose. Imagine if an Egyptian had written that story. The Israelites stole their stuff, and they cursed them so that their God unjustly killed their children. And then they ran away from us with our stuff. And in pursuing that which was rightly ours, we bravely drowned in pursuit of it. So which is it? Depends who you ask. They both could be true, just different perspectives. And so we get a particular perspective, and it's going to be a perspective based on the fact that God is the God of all reality. A running commentary. When necessary, the narrator, I lost my voice 2 weeks ago, so if it goes out, that's sin in my life. When necessary, the narrator will stop the story to explain something to the reader. Every once in a while, the narrator will stop and say, oh, by the way. Does that in Deuteronomy. At one point, there's this giant and he dies. And the narrator stops and says, he's so big that his bed was like this iron bed that was real big. And if you want to see the bed, here's where it's at. It's the coolest thing. I went there. I wasn't there. I'm kidding. I did not go there. But it would have been cool to see this bed. Sometimes he'll provide the necessary historical background. Ruth 1:1, in the days when the judges ruled. Now he's put us in the context of the judges. So he gives us that necessary information. Sometimes he'll explain something that the reader might not know. This was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm a transaction, he talks about kinsman redeemer. What he does is for his original first-time readers, he gives them information. So kids yesterday were asking me, if I could go back in history anytime, when would it be? Well, in my class, you can't have your phones out. And I just say put them away, and they're pretty good about it. But as soon as we get a break, all the phones come out. And I'd say I'd go back to the 1970s when we were kids because nobody had phones. You say, but you'd miss phones. I said, nah. Because look at you guys. There's 8 of you, and none of you are talking to each other. We would just sit and shoot the breeze. What a much better way to live. And so in the former times, before we had phones, believe it or not, there was a day that 9/11 hadn't happened and there were no phones. Sometimes he'll explain a little more about what has happened. So these took Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpah. Do you know Oprah? She was named after Orpah, just her mom misspelled the name. So she should have been Orpah, but she's Oprah. Yeah, no big deal. And the name of the other is Ruth. So we get information. Sometimes he'll provide a theological rationale. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. So they go back to there's no food in Bethlehem. They go back. Why? Not because the growers had growed it. They go back because God had provided it. It's a theological understanding. How are you able to pay your bills this month? God provided a check. Little do I say I worked for it, but it was really God. Does that make sense? All right. Fraught with background. Anytime you need me to shut up, I will. I love this stuff, so I could talk all day at 1,000,000 miles an hour. There's an article written by a German scholar during World War II, and he goes to Turkey. So the war's on, and he's a scholar, and he's studying Odysseus, and he's studying the biblical Hebrew text. And he gets to the point where Odysseus goes home, and his old nanny begins to wash his feet, and she finds the scar where he had torn his Achilles as a little boy. And there's this great description of how she remembers the event, and as she's there washing, she goes back in time, and she remembers him as a little boy, and she's feeling and trying to figure it out if it's really him. Because remember, Penelope is now looking for a husband because she's convinced Odysseus is dead. Well, then he goes to Genesis 22, where Isaac is sacrificed by Abraham. And the writer doesn't tell you anything. And so what he comes up with is this idea that the Bible is fraught with background. That is, it tells you very little. Not because they can't, but because it's in the little that you get much. And so the little tells you every detail you have to pay attention to. And so let's see, number 6 here, Auerbach continued that the biblical writers did just about the opposite of what Homer does. They only told you what you needed to know and not much else. So in Genesis 11, the first thing you hear, and it's usually the first thing you hear is that Sarah was barren. So you know she can't have kids. And then the next line after that, and she could not have children. So you get it twice, which means, this dude was uncoordinated. He could not walk. Well, you don't want him on your basketball team. You're finding out that the story about Sarah is going to be all about children, and it is. That Eglon was extremely fat. That's the Ehud story, and that drives the story. If he'd been skinny, we couldn't have had this story. That Saul was taller than anyone else. Remember, the average person is probably 5'2" or so. So Saul might have been 5'6" or 5'7", but he's a monster in those days. And you would have been Goliath's wife. You think about Goliath, people say 9 feet. If he was even 6 feet tall, he would have been a monster. Abraham Lincoln was 6'4", remember? And everyone looks at him and says, you're huge. You ever gone to Chicago? Everybody's 6'4". My 2 children are 6'4". My brother's kids are 6'4". So everybody's tall, but not in those days. And Saul gets made king. Why? Because he's tall. And that's going to be a problem, because tall doesn't mean good. That Abishag was astonishingly beautiful. Remember, David is old, and they can't keep him warm, and they bring in Abishag. And the whole idea is, if we can get him aroused, maybe he'll come back to life. It's this whole, there's all these sexual undertones that are just wonderfully provocative that you can't read in English because you'd get slapped. But Abishag is beautiful, because if she's just there to make him warm, you don't make her beautiful, you make her large. You get an Eskimo woman, you don't get her. It's just, that's racist. So take that. You get, I don't know. Sorry. Rather than being a weakness, Auerbacher endorsed this characteristic of the Hebrew storytellers because it forced the reader to pay attention to every little detail. Ruth is from Moab. Why does that matter? Whole story revolves around the fact that she's from Moab. Naomi's husband died. Why does that matter? Well, we're going to see. And Boaz is a widower. Boaz is a kinsman. So they drop little bits here and there. First impressions. Again, we said that often the most important thing you find out is either the first description or their first action. So left-handed Ehud. We're told he's left-handed. It sets everything in motion. Ruth's determination to go with Naomi. That Boaz was Naomi's kinsman redeemer. We know that. But Naomi doesn't, Ruth doesn't. And that Hannah was barren. And that, remember, she's the mother of Samuel. And the other wife, Peniel, had all these kids. And Hannah goes to the tabernacle, and Eli, the priest, sees her and thinks she's drunk. And he says, shame on you for being drunk in public. She said, I'm not drunk, I'm just in despair. I can't have children. He said, by this time next year, you'll have a son. And they name him Samuel, El, God, Shammah, hear, God will hear you. And she said, I promise I'll bring this child to you. And he grows up in the tabernacle. The next is chiasm. Questions? I know it's a lot. You can read it again during the sermon when you have some downtime. Chiasms. Chiasms can be found in a sentence, a paragraph, or even several paragraphs. Remember, there's debate as to whether all this was written down at first, or was some of it oral, or was it both? Who could write? When did writing happen? You look at Moses and you say, we would say he wrote Genesis through Deuteronomy, except there is Hebrew, Proto-Hebrew, early Hebrew doesn't come along until about 1000 BC, the time of David. So if Moses wrote, what did he write in? There's no Hebrew really to write in. Hieroglyphs? Some would argue it was all oral and passed along. I don't know. So when we talk about original autographs, if we could find these original texts, boy, for those early books, there might not be original text. Now, don't record that because I don't want to get in trouble. So here, when they write, they often write so that people can remember. Chiasms are a way to remember. Here's a chiasm, number 2. So A would be you have a statement of fact. John Manugian is a principal. B, he yells at students. C, they cry. The middle part would not have would not have a partner. It's the middle part would be, and their mothers get mad. And then the second half would be an undoing of all the first half. So if in C they cry, now they're happy. And B, John smiles at them. And then A, you get back to John Manugian as the principal. And everything is pointing towards the center, but written in such a way that you have partners. And we're going to see that Ruth is going to be written that way. So in a chiasm, elements within a text mirror each other. Why? Well, some of it's theological and some's practical. Some would say, top of 8, that this technique points to the oral nature of the text. Maybe. The middle piece is often the most important statement. Now we're going to see that Ruth is going to have just like one middle piece. It's really going to have like 2 sections that seem to fit together. But like in chapter 2, here's how it works. Look how it begins. It's a conversation. Look how it ends, a conversation. Then there's gleaning, that is going after food. There's a conversation with Boaz. Then Boaz talks to Ruth and he shows his favor. And then Ruth has a response in each of them. And then there's a statement in the middle that drives all of chapter 2. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given to you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. It's at that point in the story that you know everything's going to be okay for Ruth. And it's done not just in story, but even the structure leads you to that conclusion. That's why you don't want to get rid of the story, because the structure itself leads you to theology. That makes sense? It's pretty cool. Deja vu all over again. So deja vu tells us that reincarnation is true. But in this story, deja vu will take you back to old stories. Now, we've got deja vu in movies. So if he's a good cowboy, he wears white. If he's a bad cowboy, he wears black. And you know there's going to be some sort of shootout. Whenever there's a fight, you know the good guy's going to get beat up and eventually win. It has to work that way. Except nowadays, like if you go to the old TV show 24, where Jack Bauer is the good guy is really a bad guy. He just has gotten permission to beat up other worser bad guys. But he's not a good guy. He breaks the rules in the midst of being good. And so we're seeing nowadays, we're seeing a breaking of those conventions. But that never happened in the good old days. But here, we're going to see stories are told over and over again for a very specific purpose. This guy, Robert Alter, calls them type scenes. Here's one of the type scenes. You see it, I think, 3 different times. A single guy goes to a well. You see it 4 times because you see it with Jesus. There he meets a woman, and they get married. You know those stories, right? It's funny because in the New Testament, we have that same story with Jesus. He goes to a well, and he meets a woman. They don't get married, but she's married. In fact, she's been married 5 times. And really what's going on with Jesus in that scene is they're retelling these stories where God visits. Here God visits. There God visits so somebody can get married. Here God visits so somebody can come to know Christ. In fact, then Christ becomes the groom and she becomes the bride. It's very powerful. At other times, stories are repeated to stress the similarity of the 2 situations. This is the one we're going to do in 2 weeks. We're going to find a story of Sodom and Gomorrah. You know the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. And the angels go down, and the angels go to the square. People think they're humans. A man's at the square, and he says, don't stay in the square. The towns would be built around some sort of water source if they had it. And he said, don't stay here. It's not safe for you. Come to my house. So they go to his house. In the middle of the night, the men beat on the door and say, send him out so that we might. The word is no. It's innuendo for no. We'd like to know him. And the man in the house said, these are my guests. In Middle Eastern culture, if they're your guest, you give them your life. These are my guests. I will give you my 2 virgin daughters. Do with them what you will. And the people refuse, and they begin to pound on the door, and the angels came, and they blind them. And then they send Lot and the family out, And they say, get out of here, we're going to destroy this land. When we get to Judges 19, so that's Genesis 19. In Judges 19, we have the same story told. A man goes to a town square. He's got a woman with him. Happens to be his concubine. And someone in the town says, don't stay here. Come to my house. Take them to their house. And I'll give you a chart on this. Inside that house now is this man and his guest and two women. The concubine and his virgin daughter. And the guys in the neighborhood knock on the door, said, send out the men. And he says, no, I'll send out my daughters. Well, in the Genesis story, the angels intervene. In the Judges story, the priest, who's the concubine, he's a Levite, he takes the woman and he throws her out. She doesn't get protected. And all night, they rape this woman. And in the morning, she comes to the very doorstep of the house she was thrown out, and she dies. It's a horrible story. And then we'll go over the story. Basically, all hell breaks loose in Israel. The Israelites have become the Sodomites. In fact, they're worse than the Sodomites. In Sodom, God prevented this horrible act, but he destroyed the country. In Israel, God did not prevent it. What's to keep them from destroying the country? It's horrible, but they do it on purpose. All right, yeah, we'll look at that. It's a tough story. Verbal humor. The biblical writers love humor. They call people weird names. Nabal, remember David's second wife? Michal's his first wife. Abigail is his second wife. And he meets Abigail through her husband, Nabal, Nabal. And it turns out his name means fool. And he wants to go against David. And his wife, Abigail, looks at David and says, well, he's just a fool. That's verbal humor, where you act what your name is. Well, in this story, the two women go to Moab, or are in Moab. Naomi and her husband, they go to Moab. There the boys marry, and their names are Machlon and Kilion. Their names are death and destruction. What do you think is going to happen to them? Hey, no laughing. This is church. Naomi, she changes her name to Bitter. My name is Bitter. Mara. Bethlehem. They leave Bethlehem because there is no bread. Bethlehem, house. Bethlehem, bread. It's a house of bread. Isn't it interesting that the house of bread, where God had led them, because that's where he gave them their inheritance, become a house where there is no bread. And then they go back because the house of bread once again has bread. See, that's funny. You say, well, it's not funny. It is funny. And Jesus, it's more like a British sense of humor. Jesus picks that up where he talks about, a camel going through the eye of a needle. Paul picks that up when he says these guys who want to circumcise, I wish they'd just do the whole thing. That's humor. We say, well, that's inappropriate humor. Go to the principal. The principal would like that one. You'd laugh. Conversation. Here we go. Stories move from action to conversation. So the story's not about event. It's really about conversation. Action is reported to get to conversation. And the conversation drives it. All right, so we're going to keep going here. Coincidence and tension. We're going to move real quickly here. I love this part. We'll work this out. But you're going to see that there's lots of coincidences in Ruth that really aren't coincidences. And there's going to be a lot of tension in Ruth that is, in the first half, is working itself. It's getting more and more tension. What's going to happen? And then you get little indications that it's going to be all right. And then the second half, that tension is relieved. And then you find out all the coincidence really isn't coincidence. It's really God, which is a theological statement in our lives. All that we think is coincidence really isn't. It's all God's guidance. Conclusion, these stories matter, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. The placement of Ruth. So it's 10:15, we got like 23 and a half minutes. In the Hebrew Scriptures, it goes law, which then the prophets and the writings, 3 separate sections. The law, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. The prophets are all the history books, Joshua, Samuel, Kings, and those are one book each. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and then the minor prophets. And they're sometimes read as one book. They read together well. And then you go to these wisdom books. Psalms, Proverbs, Job, Song of Solomon, and then Ruth. Ruth is a wisdom book. Wisdom, how to practically live out what you believe. Boaz says this, and now my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask. From all my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman. There's one other place in the entire Bible that that phrase, worthy woman, appears. Do you know you're a good Christian woman who goes to Bible studies? Proverbs 31. A virtuous woman who can find? And then you've got this list of undoable lists for the perfect woman. I can bring home the bacon, fry it up in a pan. And it's this stuff that you just, you throw this. You should be able to work full time and raise your family and have businesses. And it's a ridiculous, you can't do it. Except when you read that in light of Ruth, she lives out what a virtuous woman looks like. So it's not that list. That list is there to say, here's the general parameters. But here it is, a woman of faith. A woman who, against the odds, perseveres. I mean, it goes on. And so in the Hebrew scriptures, as wisdom literature, Ruth, who's not even Jewish, forces you to consider what it means to be a worthy woman who trusts in Yahweh. Isn't that cool? So it's a different picture. So that's why is there now the English versions. The English versions follow the order of the Greek Septuagint, another history written about 300 BC and on, written by Jews against Christians. Christians had sort of co-opted the Old Testament. And so Jewish scholars got together and said, we need our own Greek that we can read. They were now speaking Greek, not Hebrew. Hebrew sort of dies away after the exile. They're speaking Aramaic, and now they need Greek. The book of Ruth follows the book of Judges. Ruth is a history book then. Takes place during the time of Judges. It's placed there, but it's going to be a theological history. But the placement is bigger than just the time period. All right, it's an antidote to the book of Judges. So here we go. Here's how Judges works. We can do this pretty quickly. The political problem, the land that had been promised, still had not been taken. So it sounds like in Joshua, people have taken the land, but they don't. They take the valleys, they don't take the hills. They can't take the land from the Canaanites that are there. And Moses says, if you leave the Canaanites there, you're going to intermarry with them and you're going to become just like them. And so the people now have become just like them. They worship other gods. B, the continual apostasy. So they worship other gods. And foreign nations always come in. It's a theological understanding of history. Nations come in and take over. And then they cry out to God and God sends a judge. But here's the problem. And you'll see this cycle over and over again. The problem is the judges get worse and worse. Othniel is the younger brother of Joshua. He's like a stand-up dude. But once you get to Ehud, the little sneaky guy, it begins to go downhill. And it ends with the worst of the worst. Number 10, Samson. Samson is not a good guy. There's nothing about Samson other than that his hair is cool. He doesn't like Jewish women. He likes Philistine women. When push comes to shove, he doesn't trust God. He does his own thing. He's vengeful. And at the end, he dies. The mercy of God is he lets him wipe out the leaders of the Philistines as he dies. But he's not a hero. He's the anti-hero. 2 supplemental stories right after Samson. That's your leader? That's the best guy you got? It's like you find out the police chief. I have a kid in my class whose dad's the police chief for the city of Miami. And so we were talking about dirty cops. The problem would be you find out your police chief is really the worst of the dirty cops. That's Samson. And then you get 2 supplemental stories. One is a sanctuary at Dan, and we'll spend a week looking at this. What happens is there's a tribe that leaves the land that God's given them. They move up north. They kill the people that live there. And then they build this big image out of silver. And then they build some other things. And they hire a Levite. And they give up on worshiping with Israel. And they do their own thing. And they think God's going to bless them because they have a Levite, but they've rejected Yahweh. That's one story. And it ends with, or begins with, there's no king in the land. The second one is the one I told you about, this poor concubine, where he really should have married her. There's a section in the beginning of the story where it looks like the dad is trying to convince the guy to marry his daughter, and he refuses. And then he takes her, and he just rejects her. So you have a Levite who has rejected normal marital policies, and then you have a people that have rejected normal sexual relationships, and Israel has become like Sodom. And the final declaration at the end of Judges, and again, we'll look at this more. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. So the line of David is going to be introduced. Finally, a king will arrive. Here's how Ruth ends. Now, these are the generations of Perez. Perez fathered Hezron. Hezron fathered Ram. Ram, Aminadab. Aminadab, Nahshon. Nahshon, Salmon. Salmon, Boaz. Boaz is our hero. Boaz fathered Obed. That's going to be the kid who's born. Obed fathered Jesse, and Jesse fathered David. The story is really not about Naomi. It's not about Ruth. It's not about Obed. It's about David. It's going to be a work that is written in order, and you're going to see the bad tribe are always the Benjaminites. Who's from Benjamin? Which king? Do you know? Do you know? Are you as smart as a 5th grade Sunday school kid? Oh, do you listen like a 5th grade Sunday school kid? I'm kidding. Who's from the tribe of Benjamin? What king? Saul's from Benjamin. So they're the bad dudes. You don't want a king who's from this tribe. You want one from the line of Judah. And we'll look at this whole prophecy going back to the beginning of end of Genesis about how the king's got to be from Judah. And here we have a king. We're doing it. Oh, look, we're already done. I did faster than I needed to. So that's good. All right, I'm going to stop here. Any questions? That was a lot. And then I'll do some characteristics, and we can actually get done 2 minutes early and go to confession and then the service. John and I need to spend longer in there.
When you mentioned Samson, and you said, is this the best we've got? It kind of sounds like U.S. politics to me.
Well, nowadays, wait. You know that you know why that's true. Just social media.
Yeah.
I mean, can you imagine any of us, if they wanted to find dirt, like who doesn't have dirt? And if you're a politician, you probably got lots of dirt. And your voting record, like who was I reading about? And he was absent for 70% of the votes. I don't know if that's true or not. But then they quote something on social media, so he looks like a very irresponsible guy. Now he's running for governor, and you think, well, how can you make, whether it's true or not, it works. So anyone, you remember when Colin Powell refused to run for president because he didn't want his family to have to be dragged through that. So yeah, that's exactly what you get. Nothing personal, but you get people like Trump who think the world revolves around them, so everything's going to be positive. And if it's said wrong, it's because of the person, not because of them. I'm not making a statement about Trump because I do like his red hair.
No, I'm just saying that the parallels between
Yes.
what's going on currently in the world. And
So that is a theological statement about leadership. Yeah. Unless your leaders are incredibly submissive to the God of history, you're in trouble. Yeah. It doesn't matter if it's Rome or Egypt or America or Israel.
the two supplementary stories about how Israel has become like Sodom, and the United States has kind of become like Sodom also. And then so we're looking for this king to be introduced in Christ.
And we do have a king.
Yes.
That's why the story has to go to Jesus. Because remember what happens with David. There's a particular woman named Bathsheba. And he likes voyeurism and more. And he's a murderer. And you watch after that how his family just is decimated. I think there are 12 responses to that where, brother Adonijah kills his brother after he rapes his sister. I mean, it's Days of Our Lives, Jerusalem style. And it just is horrible. So David can't be the dude. And you go through Israeli history, or Israelite history, and none of the kings except maybe Josiah, but he dies young. So where are we? And then Jesus is born.
The point I think I'm trying to come to as I process out loud. Because
I'm sorry, Kent, I know you're the only one listening, but yeah, we're talking about leadership and what we see in Ruth and Judges seems a lot like even today. So go ahead. This is Chris.
Right, so even in all of this stuff that's going on, it's still redeemable. That's
Yes.
the story.
Even it's still redeemable. She's saying it is still redeemable. And you know why it's still redeemable? Because last class, God is gracious. And Jesus comes, remember in John, twice the descriptions, full of grace and truth. And so he comes with the truth, but it's not a truth to bash. It's a truth to redeem. And so the story of Ruth, if you end with moral principles about how to be a godly woman, or you want to extrapolate and say a godly man, you've done okay, but you've gotten to the first level when you really need to get to the 5th level, and that's Jesus. We need Jesus. And so that's where this story is ultimately going to go. Thank you. That's good. What else? Yes. You know you only get one question first week, unless you pay that $10, and then you get to. This is Ann. You don't know Ann.
It's not a question, it's just a comment that it's so comforting to know that we have a ruler over all.
Yes. So she's saying it's comforting to know that we have a ruler over all of us. I'm grading some papers for school that I'm teaching for. And there's this guy, Cross. He's fascinating. He died, I don't know, in 2008, but he's like he's like the scholar of all scholars. He was at Harvard for years, and all the main Old Testament theologians have studied under this guy. Well, he's trying to make sense of history and the mythological presentation in the Bible. And he ends up getting to the point where the history doesn't really matter as much. And so the events, it doesn't matter that the events happened. But if we're going to have a ruler, the events matter. We have to have an actual history. This has to have happened. You can't just tell fiction, and from fiction, you can get some cool principles. I can learn some cool things from A Tale of Two Cities, but those guys didn't exist, and Jesus does. You're right. We have a ruler. Yep. And he probably wears glasses like yours. Jesus doesn't need glasses. Yes, Donna.
I was thinking about the current events
So Donna's thinking about current events.
lately in England, and yesterday when,
Queen died, in case you didn't know.
yeah, so there's Camilla,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I was thinking, next, that the narrative should have been Diana there.
Should have been Diana, not Camilla. Camilla.
And then also, Queen Elizabeth II really wasn't supposed to be there. It was
Correct.
Her brother abdicated the throne,
Her uncle,
her uncle, sorry,
because he's hanging out with that woman.
right, the divorcee from America.
You read those stories? It sounds like she didn't even like him anyway. It's a great story. I love gossip like that.
In that visual, there's Harry.
Yes, good.
And then there's
Yeah.
the Queen
So Herod, yep. I was,
there, but
it would have been, yes, you got it. And Herod's there because he went to school with the Roman Caesars, and they knew they could relatively trust him not to cheat them out of too much money. So they put him on the throne, even though he's only half Jewish. So when Jesus is born, that's why he's so afraid. Here's a real Jewish king.
it's not always the straight American.
Correct. It's never the straight. Look at your life, how straight. I mean, you went to Miami Christian College. If you just keep the principles of the Bible, shouldn't it?
Yeah, I didn't even.
Come on, what's your problem? If you'd been like that, look how straight my life's been. Because I've simply obeyed God. That's a joke, in case you don't know.
I think it's because they let me dance at the wedding I sang at.
At least you didn't drink alcohol. Did you drink alcohol too? Oh, thank God. I would have sent you to hell. I was reading something about the queen, and at age 11, she realized she was probably going to have to be the queen. And it was a letter she wrote to one of her little friends, just saying how things are going to change, but I hope you come and visit. And they now had to curtsy to their best friend. And they'd go places, and everybody would curtsy in front of her as a little kid, and her whole world just changed. But they said her personality was such that she, stiff upper lip is the term they used, that the only place she could actually show her emotions was she could go to the castle in Scotland when she was older, but her dogs and her horses. Yeah, it's really a sad life. She's only worth $423 million, but other than that, I mean, I think poor thing.
I was thinking my mother and Faye Elizabeth was her name, Faye Elizabeth, and the Queen, they're having high tea together.
Yeah. Imagine if Diana had lived and she had become the queen. Think what a day of sadness but rejoicing this would have been. Well, that would have been fascinating. Well, here we go. Any other questions? All right, here we go. Some characteristics of Ruth. It's a theological retelling of the story of Naomi and Ruth. So it is a telling of it, but it's a theological retelling. That is, theology is going to drive the history. It's not going to alter the history, but it is going to determine what events are presented. Secondly, it's fraught with background. There's so much they don't say. So, what did Naomi look like? Ruth look like? When little Obed was born, what was her labor like? When they went to Bethlehem, where did they live? And how far did she have to walk to go to the fields? And Boaz, they present him as older, but how much older? And the city gates, what did they look like? And did he walk in? And we can talk about the city gates. It's pretty cool. And there's section to it. Was it the first section, second section? How many people were watching? There's so many questions that they don't answer. Why? Because you're getting to the punchline. You're driven by the theology, so you only give a little bit. Conversation predominates. Notice how often in Ruth you do something and they stop. So she goes out to the fields to glean, but she never gleans. She just talks. So I get to work. And then she goes to the threshing floor, and it's all conversation. It's this long, wonderful, it's a humorous conversation because it's totally inappropriate. There's nothing inappropriate that happens, even though you'll often hear that. There's a term that's used, regalim, that is translated feet, but it can also mean other parts of your body. And so there's a question as to what she uncovered in the name of Jesus again. And so but it's conversation. It's a chiastic structure to the entire book. We'll look at that. You're going to see it begins and ends, and then it's going to move. Tension drives you to the middle, and then the resolution of the tension takes the second half. And then here we go. Growing tension leads to resolution. Two more. The reuse of an earlier storing at the threshing floor. Really what's going to happen at the threshing floor is you're going to have a retelling of the birth of the kingdom of the Moabites. Do you guys know that story? After Sodom and Gomorrah, we'll look at this, but after Sodom and Gomorrah, Lot goes into a town, Zoar, and then up into a cave with his 2 daughters. They realize they will never have children. So in turn, they get their father so drunk, he has no idea what happens. And these 2 wonderful women sleep with their dad, one on a Wednesday night, one on a Thursday night, and they each get pregnant. And one is the father of the Perizzites, I believe, and one is the father of the Moabites. And in the threshing floor, we re-enter that story with Ruth now as the protagonist and Boaz as Lot. And there's going to be a child born, but it's a whole different story. And finally, the introduction of the line of David in preparation for the Messiah. It doesn't end with David. And it's interesting, even the writers of the story seem to realize it's bigger than David. Because the promise to David in 2 Samuel 7 is someday there will be a seed born to you, and this person will reign forever. David won't reign forever, but one of his descendants will. And so the driving question from David on is, who will it be? Will it be Solomon? Will it be Rehoboam? And so that's why in the northern kingdom, the 10 tribes that rebel, they have different kings. But in the southern kingdom, it's always the tribe of David that is the kings. Why? Because you've got to keep the continuity in line with the promise. And guess who's from the line of David on both sides? Jesus. So. How many generations? Yeah, I think 12 maybe. I think Matthew makes it 12, but whether it's really 12 or not, I can count and see. He goes from Adam to, where did you go? Adam to David, and David did, I have to look at that again and see, but he systematizes it. And it's hard to know sometimes if so-and-so begot so-and-so, if he really begot that person, or if there's people in between. Because sometimes the genealogies are a little different. Or maybe they go by different names. And that's where we're going. Should be fun. It's only 4 chapters, but it's an incredible 4 chapters. Any questions? And if nobody shows up next week, that makes sense to me. So, all right, we're good? We're going to pray? Father, thank you for the faithfulness of Ruth, the honesty of Naomi, the willingness of Boaz to father someone else's child. David, a man after God's own heart, who makes it clear to us that you're not about religious obedience. We need a Savior. And then thank you for Jesus. We could, in more general ways, talk about how this makes us more like God, but we have to get to Jesus. Luke 24, Jesus says all of Scripture is about Him. And so whenever we get to the Father and we don't get to the Son, we've never gotten to the Father. And so Jesus, may we lift Him up in our talking and even in our joking. May we understand He's alive. He is in us through His Spirit. And He even now is gathering a people. Someday He will return. He'll look at us and hug us and say, "Well done, good and faithful servant." We are saints because of the blood of Jesus. We may not be good, but we are holy because you've called us holy. So each story here, we give them to you that you might be honored. We have no idea what this week holds. You're in charge and we're not. And we humble ourselves before you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Thank you. Thank you.